Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here. It's interesting. I think the most fun presentations I've ever given were at the Houston Children's Museum about 20 years ago, when we had a 4-part series on play. And so it was a public presentation. It would be in the evenings, and each one of the presentations was about an hour. And the reason it was so pleasant for me was that I was forced to leave my comfort zone, which at that time was talking about the brain. I mean, I know a lot about the brain. I was studying the brain. I was studying trauma. I was working with maltreated kids, mostly kids that were at risk. And I knew by that time already a lot about how early developmental experiences profoundly alter the brain. And one of the things that this is from over 20 years ago actually, one of the things that we started to see when we looked carefully at the development of these really seriously maltreated children who had early developmental neglect was literally that you could physically see that their brains were developing differently. Now, the neuroimaging techniques that were available back then were much less sophisticated than they are now, but even with those techniques, we could see things like this. This is a 3-year-old child. This is a child who had normal development, and this child's head circumference, in other words, the size of their head, is in the 50th percentile. We didn't pick some big melon-headed kid to do this. This is what we call a typical child in the 50th percentile. And this is a child who spent the first 2 years of his life in a very, very sensory depriving setting. Not much touch, no opportunity for play. And you can see the brain's smaller, and there are much larger spaces here. These are called ventricles, but what that indicates is that underdevelopment of key parts of the brain that are in that area. And this is something that we saw in many, many, many kids. So what I was doing at that time was studying how early developmental experiences altered the stress response, changed the development of the brain, and so I got asked to give this presentation about, Dr. Perry, you know so much about children in the brain. Come and talk about play. And I'm like, play? Sure. Yeah, let me talk about play. So I actually, being a responsible person, I said, I will come, and of course, being a doctor, I acted like I knew all about it. Well, sure, yeah, I can talk about play. I know all about play. And so I actually started to read a lot about play, and over time, I actually have developed a little bit of expertise about play. One of the first things that I read about, and I knew about actually, because I spent a lot of time out, and I did this intentionally. I didn't just do this on purpose, to just randomly show you pictures of animals in wilderness. One of the things that we know about the animal kingdom, and you all probably can think of examples of this that you've seen in documentaries. Animals play. Animals do all kinds of joyful activities that appear to have no obvious intentional purpose in the moment. But as we study these animals, what we learn is that their play is all about learning how to read and respond to the nonverbal signals of their mother, of their animal peers, learning how to negotiate loss of balance, learning how to get comfortable in water, learning how to experience the world. But they do it, they have these new experiences again and again and again and again in an environment that is for them safe, and they leave their comfort zone and they try on new things. And with trying on new things, they take advantage of one of the fundamental principles of the brain that I was studying at the time, and that's called use-dependent development, activity-dependent differentiation. What that basically means is neural networks in your brain change with repetition. The more you activate and activate and activate and activate something, the more you get change in the brain. So, even though they were having fun and they were exploring new things, they were literally building in neurobiological capabilities that would help them survive. Play had intention. It's just that when you see a bunch of wolves, as I have seen, in fact, I saw it on this day. I snowshoed back 20 miles back into the Canadian Rockies in an isolated pass. Started at 2 in the morning. It was moonlight. And it was all white, so I didn't need any light. I could see. But as the sun was coming up, I came over a tiny little rise in this trail, and off about maybe 100 yards off to my left was a little bit of a hill. And on that hill, after there'd been a beautiful snowfall the night before, and on that hill was a pack of wolves sliding up and down the hill. They were playing. And they were running and jumping on each other, and they were playing King of the Hill, and somebody gets to the top, and then, they'd sort of push that person down, and then they were scurrying around. Now, those of you who don't know anything about wolves know that they're pack animals or social animals. And one of the things they do to stay safe is that they have sentry animals that are assigned tonight you can't play, sorry. You gotta watch out for danger from this quadrant, and you gotta watch out danger from this quadrant, and you watch for danger from that quadrant. And so they had 4 sentinel wolves, and I could see them, and I wanted to take a photograph so bad, but I knew if they saw me move a fraction, they would be gone. So I watched them for a while, and of course me thinking that, 4 minutes of being still is really a long time. Wolves are way better at being still than we are. And so I go to get my camera, and I just glance down to make sure that I'm not going to make a noise by getting into my camera case, and I look up, they're gone. Rats! I didn't get any photographs, but I saw them play. Now, the roundabout story of this is, as I started to learn about play, I began to realize that I didn't want to talk about play the way you think about play. I wanted to talk about play the way play should be valued. Because I know that most of you and most of the people who are going to hear me 20 years ago in that series were thinking about play as an elective. They were thinking about play as an adjunct to what you do after you have sort of done your homework, done your chores, and now you can play. But I realized that that was a tiny little fraction of what play really is, and it's a distortion of the power of play. Because the truth is, play is something that we incorporate every day into many of our activities, as we should. But what I want to do, I don't want to take too much time, because I want to have a little bit of a discussion about this, but I want you to walk out of here with some appreciation that play, the process of leaving your comfort zone to try on something new and practice something new, starting from a place of safety, is actually the fundamental activity that builds resilience. To build a healthy child, you have to have an opportunity to leave your comfort zone, to practice something new, and to go back to your comfort zone. It is the fundamental activity of play. Play involves leaving your comfort zone in different kinds of ways. And what is playful to the infant is different than what is playful to the toddler, which is different than what is playful to the 35-year-old. But each one of us, when we are engaged in play, will be activating key systems in our brain that will help us be better at whatever it is that we do. Whether it's parent, whether it's supervise, whether it's learn the fundamental skills of forming and maintaining relationships. Play is at the core of every one of those things. So let me back up, do a little science. Do not be afraid. Let me start with this. This is a little scary. I'm just going to, but I want to reassure you that what I'm about to tell you, most of this is not really completely true. And in part because what I'm trying to capture is so remarkably complex that any effort to use human words to describe it or images to supplement what I'm describing will leave inadequacies. So this is absolutely true. Any way we try to understand these complex aspects of human development and human interactions will have some shortcomings. So just keep that in mind, and let's talk a little bit about the complexities we're dealing with. This is a picture of the brain. Now, I just want to let you know, this kind of looks like what the brain looks like, but the truth is, this is a model. This isn't really what the brain looks like. You have no blue things going in your head. You know, you don't have any green things and yellow things. That's not really what the brain looks like. This is a model. It's a model of the brain that is trying to help you understand something about the three-dimensionality of the brain. The fact that there are different systems in the brain that seem to be interactive and do different things. And it's an opportunity for people like me to say, hey, you know, the brain has these different parts. You know, the brain's got a brainstem, and the brain's got the cortex, and these areas are kind of connected, and we can do all kinds of things and say all kinds of stuff, but that's a model. Now, how many of you have heard of neurons? Awesome. Is there anybody in here who's not heard of what a neuron is? And if so, do you think anybody would ever be brave enough to admit in front of a bunch of strangers that they don't know what a neuron is? No, I have to say, I've given this presentation, I'll talk about the brain a lot. I actually had a person last month in British Columbia raise her hand. And I'm like, oh my God, you're the first person in my entire life who's admitted they don't know what a neuron is. And I love you for it, I know, thank you. So we talked about what neurons are, but I know that most people would not agree. Neurons are specialized cells. Now, this is a model. It's an artist's rendering to try and give you some idea of what happens in neurons. And they have these little shiny, flashy things that like, wow, something must be happening there. And so this is useful because it's helping you understand that neurons send signals to other neurons. They communicate. And where one neuron comes up against another neuron, they release chemicals like norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin. And the chemicals go across a space called a synapse. And they bind to a protein on the other side, on the other neuron, called a receptor. And that makes changes take place inside that neuron that will transmit signals. And so what happens is functions, brain-mediated functions like vision and hearing and movement and feeling and thinking, all of these things are the product of chains of neurons communicating with each other in a very complex, dynamic way that we know just a fraction about. Now, this isn't really what happens in the synapse either. Synapses are, there's no little shiny thing. I'm going to communicate. That's not what happens. But this communicates the fact that there's some kind of weird magic going on here in that synapse. And it is useful to help you capture that concept. But it's more complex than that because, well, first of all, back up for a second. You've got a billion of those things just in a tiny little cubic centimeter. We're just going to take one of those synaptic boutons and open it up. And in that synaptic bouton, you see all kinds of things, and those are proteins and other structures. But if you magnify it even more, you see all these floating things around. These are proteins, and these are proteins, and magnify that, and then you get all of this. Now, just so you know, this is from Science Magazine. Science Magazine is for scientists. Even scientists use models. Look at this. Do you think you literally really have colored wiggly things in your synaptic boutons? No, they made this up. It's a model. But it's useful because it helps you understand that even the simplest structural thing it has all of this complexity. And every one of these individual proteins has several genes involved in production and regulation of them. So, and that's just the structural complexity of the person. Those little synaptic things here are firing at a rate that leads to 2.5 quadrillion polarizations per minute. So now I want you to close your eyes and think about the least functional human being you know. And change your view of them. You need to now view this least functional person as a miracle of complexity. And you have to give them their due. We're complex in ways that are beyond our current comprehension. But within that complexity, there are certain principles and concepts that are more understandable. So I'm going to use this simpler model to teach you a couple of core concepts about how the brain is organized, about a stress response, about how important stress is to health, and the role that play has in developing resilience. So let's start with this. This is a cartoon. It is meant to illustrate several things. First thing, different parts of the brain. This is the lower part of the brain, and it mediates simpler functions. This is the top part of the brain, and it mediates the most complex, most human functions. So here's the key, important principle. This is fundamentally important. The top part of your brain, the cortex, is a part of the brain that you teach to. When I want to teach you values, I'm trying to get something to your cortex. I'm not trying to change your resting heart rate. I'm trying to get a complex concept to your cortex. And we'll come back and talk about that in a minute. But the cortex is the most uniquely human part of the brain. It is the most uniquely human part of the brain, and it mediates speech and language, and it mediates abstract thinking, and it mediates where our values and our morals go. And it also is the only part of the brain that can tell time. This will become important when I talk about play. So, you have this incredibly complex organization. You've got 86 billion moving parts. How do you get 86 billion things to work together in seamless fashion? It's very hard to do. I mean, think about how many people you have in your family. I have a family. We'll go on a family vacation. We can't freaking coordinate where to eat dinner. I mean, it's like planning the invasion of D-Day to figure out where we're going to go have dinner. How do you organize 86 billion things to do something in a synchronous fashion? It's very hard. And one of the fundamental architectural techniques that your brain uses to help create synchronous, organized functioning across multiple parts of the brain is to have certain special neural networks that are able to communicate simultaneously with multiple parts of the brain and the body so that there can be instantaneous communication to multiple parts of the brain. And so these organizing networks are so important that most of you have heard of them. I mean, even though probably most of you are not neuroscientists, but I would imagine most of you have heard of dopamine, or serotonin, or norepinephrine, or adrenaline. The reason you've heard of them is because they play a major role in this orchestrating process. And so here's what you need to know. Because of this architecture, because they're localized in the lower part of the brain, and they have the ability to organize and influence all different parts of the brain, and organize and influence what's going on in the body. They control the autonomic nervous system, the neuroendocrine system. Some of you have heard of the HPA axis and all that kind of stuff. These neural networks control. What that means is this architecture is essential to the stress responses we have when we feel threatened or when we have some physiological need. So, now, I don't want to get too complex about this, but I just wanted to point this out. Second thing I want to point out is this. Take the same architecture and you look at the way your body is essentially getting information into the brain. So your body gives feedback to your brain about how much oxygen you have, right? And if you don't get enough oxygen because you're walking up steps, what will happen is you'll start to take deeper breaths. And this part of this feedback, your sensory apparatus from your body, sends signals into this part of the brain, and all of your senses, touch, smell, sight, sound, all send information into these lower parts of the brain too. So the interesting and important thing to remember about development is that these lower parts of the brain receive first and have first option to act on information from your body and information from the outside world. Now here's the problem. This part of your brain is actually much more similar to a lizard than a human. And so the first part of your brain that has the option to act on incoming information also happens to be the dumbest part of your brain. And it's a part of your brain that can't tell time. So the truth is, if previous in your life you made an association, a connection between a certain kind of eye contact and nurturing, you could have somebody look at you a certain way, and this part of your brain would start to think, he loves me. Or you could have made an association with eye contact and threat. And so a teacher will look at you, and this part of the brain will go, he hates me. And this misinterpretation of the external world happens all the time. We all have our own personal filters about how we interpret incoming information, and that comes from our developmental experiences. The human brain develops from the bottom to the top and from the inside out, sort of like an unfolding flower. And as you heard, the majority of the primary associations you make about the world, the majority of synaptic connections that you have in your squash, in your head right now, were created in the first 4 years of your life. Now you make modifications and you add a few things here and there, but the truth is, relative to the number of associations you make about the world, it's pretty small. Let me back up a second. We're going to go to this part, this kind of, people like this part, because they get to laugh about what I used to look like. All right, so look at that. I had brown hair. This is what I looked like when I used to live in Chicago. Now I don't live in Chicago and I have gray hair. That's a lesson there. There's a lesson there. All right. So this is a plate of living neurons. Once I get to it, if you look, let me grab this. You're going to get to a plate of living neurons. You'll see them moving, and then you'll see a magnification of these neurons. See them here, where it's moving. Now, see this right here? See this right here? These are two neurons, and they're sending out what we call little neurites. And these neurites are seeking connection. And what happens in the brains of little children, particularly in the first year of life, is that they're trying to make associations between patterns of neural activity that co-occur. Now remember, you all learned this, but I'm going to remind you. You all learned that hearing comes into your brain separate from vision, right? It does. And in order for you to make sense out of the world, you have to connect vision with sound, sight and sound. You have to connect touch with affect. You have to make all these associations about what is going on out there. You have to, quote, make sense of the world. And you make sense of the world by creating billions of these associations. And so let's pretend you're a little boy and you're just, developing language, and you see a four-legged furry creature and somebody keeps saying dog. You hear the sound dog. In the beginning, the sound dog has no meaning whatsoever. But because you hear it every time that you see this four-legged furry creature go along, and mom keeps pointing out, say doggy, say doggy, see doggy, you make an association, and all of a sudden there's a connection made, and the next time you see that four-legged furry creature, you stimulate the auditory part of your brain, and you go doggy. Or if somebody says doggy and that gets stimulated, it goes to the visual cortex, and you can create an image of a dog in your head. This is what happens in early developmental experience. You create these primary associations. Now, here's the thing that becomes a little interesting. Your brain is magnificent, it's astounding, and you saw how many moving parts you have, but here's the reality. It takes a lot of energy to make these synaptic connections. And once you've made a connection like this, it's really hard to repurpose that connection. If it takes 1,000 repetitions to create this neural network, it only takes one repetition in the next 1,000 weeks to maintain it. So there are words that you learned in middle school that you haven't used for 15 years. But if you read the word, you know what it meant. There are people in this room who have not ridden a bike in a while, and if I put you back on a bike, you'd be able to ride a bike. Yes, you would. Somebody's back there, I could do it. Yes, you could. So, here's what happens to these original associations. This little boy goes over to grandma's house and he sees a four-legged furry creature, and he goes, doggy. And grandma says, no, honey, that's not a dog, it's a cat. And he goes, no, it's a dog. Sure. Well, I'm sure you're getting there. It's a doggy. And she says, no, honey. It's like a doggy, but it has additional qualifiers. So you start to make an association between this primary association, and you go the qualifier, pointed ears, and the qualifier over here, you make another sort of more complex association, pointed ears, and it's smaller with whiskers, and then you go make this association. It actually has an attachment disorder, okay? I love that joke. I love that joke, but I can always see in the audience who loves cats. Sorry. It was a joke. Anyway, so, now, if you are a child and you're trying to make an association, you're trying to make sense out of the world, and somebody makes you sit down. Sit down in the big apple pie circle, don't move, sit down, and I'm going to teach you the alphabet. Is there pleasure in that? So children who are taught the alphabet in a non-pleasurable way don't make an association between learning and fun. If you learn to read in the arms of grandpa, grandma, mom, dad, somebody who will let you play with them, they play with you all, they literally play with you, they touch, they're making an association between warmth and regulation and play and fun and special attention and reading. Kids that learn to read in the arms of a loved one come to love reading. And they seek it out. Kids who are taught to read because it is one of the core things that you have to master by the time you're 5 years old in order to qualify the state requirements for being prepared to learn, hate learning. If you ask even good students who have been in these pressure cooker academic environments if they read for pleasure, the vast majority of them say no. And the kids that do read for pleasure, you find out that they learned how to read because they were read to in with a regulated parent who also got pleasure out of the interaction, or grandparent or adult. I could go on and on, but the point is this. When you're sitting in the arms of grandpa at night and you're reading a story and you goof around, it's play. It's playful. Now, the other thing that happens in this primary association, and this is one of the core aspects of play, play has rhythm incorporated. Play is rhythm. Why is rhythm important? Rhythm is important because when you are a little fetus, and this part of your brain is actively organizing, because this part of the brain has to be ready to go by the time you're born, right? Because it controls blood pressure, heart rate, body temperature. It has to be organized. And so what happens is this part of the brain is actively organizing, and you have apparatus that tell you, as a fetal body, you get feedback in the lower part of your brain that says, I'm not hungry because I'm stealing your calories. And it says, I'm not cold because I'm 98.7. It says, I'm not thirsty. So if you're not thirsty, you're not cold, you're not hungry, you're what we call regulated. You have no physiological distress coming from your body. You are regulated. And so your brain starts to make an association between being regulated and the nonstop sensory input that's coming into your brain from maternal heart rate. So, mother's heart is going the whole time you're in utero. And your brain organizes in rhythm. Human beings are, actually all living creatures are rhythmic creatures. Human beings are rhythmic. We're conceived in rhythm and we develop in rhythm. I didn't even make a joke about that. I can see where you could turn that into something funny, but I didn't. So your brain organizes in rhythm. It's continuous, non-stop, and the rhythm comes in through auditory routes, it comes in through tactile routes because you feel the vibration, and it comes in through pressure routes. You feel the pressure of the aorta. Literally, you can feel it in utero. There's 3 routes of pattern, repetitive, syncopated rhythms that are associated, that are taking place at the same time that you're getting the non-stop feedback of what I'm regulating. And so after you're born, and to this very day, in every one of you, you will find pattern, repetitive, rhythmic things regulated. Whether it's walking or listening to music, whether it's davening, whether it's drumming, whether it's doing needlepoint, whether it's spackling, whether it's painting. Pattern, repetitive, rhythmic things make you feel regulated. Now, why is regulation so important for the development of the child, and where does play come in? It's so important for the child because if you are not regulated, you will not get stuff to your cortex. So when kids are walking around, I was here today. I challenge any of you to find a child who's in this place who's not moving. Who's not, for a moment they may pause and look at something, but even then they'll be touching, and they'll be pushing, and they'll be listening, and then they'll walk around, and they'll be running. And movement is literally a precursor to developing normal social skills and cognitive skills. It's interesting, if you take kids and you immobilize them and try to teach them cognitive things, they learn that. They learn cognitive things, but they learn it at a rate about 1/5 of children who are allowed to move. Rhythm literally opens up a freeway to the middle part of your brain so that you can develop social emotional skills and practice that, and to your cortex so you can develop cognitive skills. Now, let's get to play. Now remember this, the sequential engagement of any person is essential to remember if you want to be an effective parent, teacher, therapist, anything. If you want to interact with another human being, and get something in your head, an idea, a story, a thought, an insight, and you want it to get into their head, it has to go from your cortex to the middle part of your brain, out your brainstem, out your body, into their brainstem, to the middle part of their brain, and then to the cortex. It's a multi-step process. And you can interfere with that in many different places. So everybody in this room has had the experience of interacting with somebody who knows that the polite thing to do is to say that I'm going to greet this person, but the greeting is going to get filtered through the way I feel about this person. And so when they say, oh, it's so nice to see you, what will happen is, as that comes out of their brain and it goes filtered up your brain, this part of your brain goes, that doesn't feel like you're so happy to see me. And it gets up here and part of your brain goes, well, that didn't feel sincere. And you may mimic back to them the same kind of thing. Lovely to see you as well. Now, we all know what that's like, so part of what I'm trying to do is point out the fact that we have this complex process involved in communication. This is why play is essential. And I'll come back and talk about this in a second. But, all right, here we go. Here's what happens with the development of your stress response system. Everybody talks about stress. And I want to talk about stress too. First thing I want to say is this, is as your brain is processing incoming information, now let's say your brain has developed a little bit, now you're 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, whatever age you are, you've got a whole catalog of associations, things that, your brain is organized based upon the experiences that you've had. And so what will happen is when you have a new experience, it'll come in, and the first thing that happens is it gets compared, the pattern of incoming information gets compared to the previously stored experience. And your brain usually says, well, this moment is some variation of a previously stored interaction. So let's say that you have a whole catalog of associations about healthy maternal caregiving. You got a mother who is attentive and attuned and responsive and loving and all this stuff, and your template associations about people are that people are regulating, they meet my needs, people are rewarding, they make me feel like by meeting my needs, they make me feel pleasure. And so now I'm meeting a new human being, and I'm perceiving attributes that are very similar to my mother, and so my default assumption is that you're going to be regulating and rewarding. And because of that default assumption, what you do is you reciprocate that expectation by giving nonverbal signals that, hi, I'm happy to meet you, and you smile. And because of the mirroring quality of human beings, it's very difficult to take a person who smiles at you and not smile back. And so what happens is your internal worldview becomes your set of expectations about what's going to happen, and your expectations literally result in behaviors that make your internal world a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think people are going to be dismissive of you, you will unconsciously, remember I talked about how if you believe people don't like me, people think I'm this, people think I'm that, what will happen is as you try to interact with them, it gets filtered through your affective memory and out in the way you interact with them, and they'll get this feeling back that says, leave me alone, and pretty soon they'll go, wow, you're sending signals back off, so I'm going to back off. And your brain says, see, they don't want to be with me. We all run into this stuff all the time. And I'm sure you're thinking about friends you know or people you know in your own family, and you're like, that's why he does that. There's people that I know that, that have the internal world of the world is so good. They have so many good things, so many loving, attentive things early in life that no matter how they get poorly treated, they always think, well, they're just having a bad day. Well, honey, he's had a bad day for 570 days in a row now. It's maybe time to actually think that he is a jerk. They see a big pile of horse shit in the front yard and go, oh, there's a pony in there. Anyway, so, I digress. What time did I start?
25 to.
So am I supposed to stop now?
Yeah.
All right.
You could have.
All right, well, so let me just do this one thing and talk about why play is so important. Why play builds resilience. So, when your brain sees any signal that's new, any pattern of neural activity that's unfamiliar, the default response of your brain is to assume that it's potentially threatening until proven otherwise, which means that the very act of being exposed to novelty makes you activate your stress response. But that doesn't have to be bad, because moderate, predictable, controllable activation of your stress response leads to resilience. So, keep in mind controllable. If you take somebody's stress response system and it is regulated here, and they start to have moderate and then unpredictable stressors, and before they can get back to their baseline after having a challenge, you give them another challenge. Now, this might be something that might happen in like an abuse situation, or this might be something that happens in an environment where there's a teacher who's having to teach based upon the chronological age of the child, and this child just happens to be a little bit behind. And so the lesson of the day is here, and they get challenged, and they start to get it done, but before they finish that, the teacher introduces a new thing. And oh, by the way, do this. And so before they can get back to their baseline, they're starting to get dysregulated. And so what happens is, when the teacher controls when you are going to be challenged, and the teacher has expectations that are really a little bit unrealistic for you, they may not be for other kids, but they are for you, you start to get a sensitized stress response system. Now, when your stress response system gets sensitized, this is what happens. For the same level of challenge, a neurotypical child will get into this active alert state. A dysregulated child gets into the sensitized state, and they get overwhelmed by something that would be just a challenge to another child. And now, you can see how this is, probably have examples of this happening in your own life or with all kids that you know. A child who can master whatever the challenge is in front of them, offered by the adults, who's neurotypically regulated, will do okay. A child who's got a little bit of sensitivity, a little bit of sensitized stress response system, they're going to be overwhelmed. Now, where this really becomes a problem is this. In order to learn anything new, you have to leave your comfort zone. Your comfort zone is essentially nothing more than a set of accumulated associations in your brain that you have from your past experiences, things you haven't learned. And so when we send our children out to school, every day what happens is we hope that the teacher gives them a set of expectations and opportunities that will do two things. Number one, it has to challenge them. You're never going to learn anything new if all you're exposed to is what you've already mastered. So it has to be a challenge. But it has to be a challenge that is not going to be overwhelming. Everybody in this room has probably been in a situation when they were asked to learn too much too fast, and they can only get part of what you want me to do, and they just get frazzled, and then And so what you do under these circumstances, if you get pushed over here, rather than learning anything, you shut down your cortex and you retreat to your old comfort zone. And you don't learn. And if you are a sensitized child, tiny, tiny, tiny little challenges will overwhelm you. Now, where does play come in? Here's play. Play is, you start in a safe and familiar environment. Here you are with your friends, with your mom, with your whatever, and there happens to be something that's novel that's over there. And because you feel safe, guess what you do? You leave your comfort zone and you go over and you start manipulating this new thing. You climb this new tree. And you climb as high as you feel comfortable, and then when it gets to be too much, you get back down and you go over here. The normal process of development of a child who's got an infant who is just getting to the point where they can leave their primary caregiver, they feel safe and regulated in the presence of their primary caregiver. And then as they start to be able to move, they want to crawl away from you. And they want to go away from you. But as they move away from you, what happens is their stress response system goes up a little, up a little, up a little, and they get to this point where like, oh, okay, I want to come back. And they'll come back and they'll go to home base and get a hug, and then they'll push you away because you're boring and I want to go out and explore the world. And what they do is they create a pattern of stress response activation where the dosing is moderate, controllable, and predictable. The problem is, if you don't create a playful environment, you don't always know what their dose is. I can't predict what's a tolerable level of exploration for this child and that child. They determine what's a tolerable distance from their comfort zone, how long they should stay out here, how they should practice, and when they should go back to their comfort zone. Adult-driven activities do not allow children to have controllable doses of stress. Play does. Kids determine how much they can manage exposure to novelty, and then they'll go back to their baseline. And then they'll go try this new thing, and they'll get frustrated with it and put it down, and they'll go back to their baseline. And they'll go back, and they do this, and they'll do iteration, and they literally become resilient by being in an environment where there is a sense of safety and connectedness, and lots of opportunities for exploring based upon where they are developmentally. So you come to this museum and you'll have 5 kids that are 5 years old. They'll go to different places. They'll go to different things. Some kids will still want sensory motor sort of stimulation. They'll play a lot with the water stuff. Other kids are a little bit more about, building things and understanding how things go together, and they'll go over to a different display. Now, the reason I'm saying that this is so important is that our culture over the last, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but what I want to point out is that what builds resilience is opportunities to leave your comfort zone from a place of safety. And because of what we've done in the modern world about compartmentalizing time and creating essentially relational poverty for our children, the average number of human beings in a typical human living group in our species, in the natural condition, is about 40 to 50 people. Continuous relational interaction, touch, eye contact, all kinds of other stuff all day long. In the modern world, we've got to the point where rather than having a ratio of 4 developmentally more mature individuals for every developing child under the age of 6, which is what the ratio was when we were in our hunter-gatherer status, we now think it's a wonderful developmental environment to have 1 adult and 4 children who are all at the same age. We think that's indulgent. The reality is even that indulgent early childhood environment model is 1/24 of the relational environment that our kids would normally prefer neurobiologically. Now, why is that related to play, and why is that important for the brain? It's important because it is these relationships that provide the safe and stable base from which you leave. They scaffold you. While you are over here with Grandpa, who really knows a lot about fires, and he's just watching you out of the corner of his eye start to explore the fire, there's somebody there who is safe, and you'll come over and he'll say, "Don't touch the fire, it's hot." And you'll come over and you'll interact with him, you get regulated, and then you go, "It may be hot, but it's really attractive." And so you'll wander over there a little bit, and you'll look at him while you go like this, and he'll go, "Don't touch that, don't touch that." And it's play. It's playful. That's play. He's leaving his comfort zone from a place of scaffolding, but see, here's what happens. He's got an auntie, he's got an older sibling, he's got cousins, he's got all kinds of people, he's got a lot of safe and stable bases to do this. But if you live in a household where there's 1 parent, 1 child, 5 TVs, 4 cell phones, video games, you end up spending almost no time with other human beings. And so the opportunities you have for relational regulation and relational creation of this safety zone from which you can leave and explore is very, very impoverished. So when you have children who are living in an environment where there's relational density, And they can have all these positive regulating opportunities. Each one of these little arrows is an opportunity to be regulated. They're positive interactions with people that they know. This is family, this is friends, this is acquaintances, this is strangers, all day long, 6 in the morning, noon, 6 at night. This is a child who has a relational milieu where they can engage and disengage. And see, the thing about engaging is I'm getting regulated, I'm having a rewarding and regulating interaction, but you know what? Now that I'm safe, I love you, Mom, but you're boring. I'm going to go explore the world. And when you explore the world, you practice and you go back and get regulated. And so when you have relational health, you have an environment that can facilitate healthy, playful exploration that is both cognitive, social, motor. But if you live in an environment that has relational poverty like this, and this is a child in foster care, and this is the best day he had in a 2-week period. He had 2 days during that period we tracked him where he didn't have one single positive human interaction. And how is this going to either be healing or resilience building? It isn't. So, play, leaving your comfort zone and practicing something new where you can explore relational things. You know, when you're a 4-year-old and you try to play a board game, what you're not really playing is the board game. What you're learning about, your play is around rules. Your play is around relationships. Your play is around turn taking. And so you're trying to figure out how to do this stuff. And by the time you get to be 6 and you know the rules, and you get upset if you don't play by the rules, their play is of a different sort. It's more cognitive. They're about the strategy of the board game. It's not about negotiating with this person about, my turn again, because I didn't get where I wanted. My turn again. They're learning social skills versus cognitive skills. And all but the same activity leads to playful growth, play-driven growth in different parts of the brain. And I can guarantee you it's a much more effective way to develop motor skills, social emotional skills, cognitive skills, than making kids sit, not move, and try to get to their cortex when they're not regulated, which is what our modern educational system does. Anyway, I've taken up too much time. There's no time for 2 questions. No. I'm going to stop now. I appreciate your attendance and your attention, and I hope that you all start to think about the important role that this museum plays in the community, because it really is a place where people know what play means and they know how to create environments where children will have lots of playful opportunities. So, thank you for your time, and I apologize that I went over my time, so I'm happy to
So do we have any questions? I don't know. Anybody got any questions? This one over here? Oh, that mic.
So when you're talking about,
I can hear.
okay, when you're talking about children in poverty and like producing the idea, you don't want to treat an 8-year-old like a 2-year-old, even though like emotionally they are. So what's
Whoa, wait, whoa. I do want to treat an 8-year-old chronologically who has 2-year-old social skills. If you don't treat them at their developmental age, you create a huge gap in expectation that they can never fill. And so what will happen is that this child will literally, they don't believe that you as the teacher, for example, are developmentally uninformed. They think that you know what you're doing. So when you give them an expectation that they can't possibly meet, and they fail again and again and again, the brain hates a vacuum. So they'll come up with some reason. And the reason won't be that you're developmentally uninformed as a teacher. It will be, I'm stupid, or I'm not good at math, or I'm not a good athlete. And these kids, when we have unrealistic expectations and we don't understand where children are developmentally, we end up creating problems. And this is one of the major problems in our current model, is that children actually can be chronologically 8, They may have the cognitive skills of a 7-year-old, typical 7-year-old. They may have the social skills of a 4-year-old, and they may have the regulation skills of a 2-year-old. And what you really need to do is to meet them with expectations and activities that will meet them in all those different domains where they are. Now, if you do that, you can catch them up. If you don't do that, this is what happens. They fall further behind. And so because we have a one-size-fits-all model, and we are creating curricular expectations and or behavioral expectations that are based on age, when kids start to fall behind, they stay behind. And then we start giving them neuropsychiatric labels. And if you're a child of color and you get old enough, we start putting you in the juvenile justice system. 35% of the kids in our juvenile justice system got there through school because they were charged with truancy or with assault. Now, what do? You've heard of the fight or flight response, right? If you have a sensitized stress response system and you don't want to go somewhere, how many of you have ever had a bad job? It doesn't feel good, right? Or how many of you in front of other people have been shown to be inadequate in some way? These kids have that experience all day long, every day. So when they get to the age where they don't have to show up at school, they start to skip school. And then when we stop them from skipping school, we put them in an environment where it's harder to be truant. And so we make it more restrictive. And if you can't flee, what do? You fight. So what we do is we end up restraining them and then charging them with assault. And because we don't understand development as a culture, and we haven't integrated these understandings into our systems, we're paying a tremendous cost. Anyway, I didn't mean to jump all over you about this, but you pointed out the absolute key challenge in juvenile justice, child welfare, mental health, and education is that what do you do with a kid who's chronologically 8 but has the social skills of a 3-year-old? And really what you have to do is come up with new ways to find developmentally appropriate but age acceptable expectations. And you can do it, but it takes a developmentally informed team to really work out how to do that without shaming the child, without creating an impossible task for the teacher and so forth. But we're doing this right now in schools all over the world and having really good outcomes. But it's hard to do. Anyway, I'm sorry. I went off.
Right. And another question?
I can see after that, no one's going to have a question.
A couple over here. So can you talk about, you pride this a lot, what the development, can you talk about the opposite end, meaning we have children that are probably above their chronological age? Because a lot of emphasis is always put on children that aren't, but there's a handful of children that aren't recognized as being there. And the challenge is making sure that they are also receiving.
That's exactly right. And one of the things I talk about when I talk about this curve actually is that because we make curricular expectations based on the mean, there are going to be kids over here who already mastered this stuff and they're bored as hell. And there's kids that are way behind and they are lost. And so what happens is both kids end up becoming a problem, both groups of kids. And so we believe in developmentally targeted opportunities and expectations. And that also means that if you've got a child who's cognitively way ahead, provide them with cognitive opportunities to keep developing. One of the biggest issues with that group, however, is that they frequently have splinter capabilities. So they may be chronologically 8, have the cognitive skills of a 12-year-old, but the social skills of a 5-year-old. And then the rest of the world thinks, Jesus, just because you can do algebra, you can do all these other mature things, and they can't. And this is a big issue. We actually do a lot of work with schools that work with gifted children. And we use the very same strategy we use with kids that are not gifted, is that if we know where they are developmentally, then we create developmentally appropriate social activities, developmentally appropriate motor opportunities, developmentally appropriate cognitive activities. And so that might mean the kid that sits down in algebra who can't even throw a baseball, which is going to lead to all kinds of weird social things if the world he lives in values sport. You have to teach them some motor skills. Teach them how to throw the baseball. But it's the same thing. You need to treat each child as unique and meet them where they are developmentally, and you'll actually have much better. And again, it's interesting, if you let these kids, it's so funny because we'll see this, if you give that kind of child opportunities for play, what you might find, and I've seen this happen so many times, there'll be these kids that are literally entering college-based classes, because they're so smart, but when you give them an opportunity to just hang out, they want to color. They'll go over and pick up a Little Mermaid thing and do coloring the Little Mermaid. Or they want to play, like Pokemon cards. And again, there's this huge split between where they are cognitive and where they are social. And I think that the problem comes when there's a mismatch between our expectations of what they are and what they're really able to do. And when we're out of sync, either overestimating or underestimating, that's a problem.